before the scalpel touched flesh. The sorrow had already been chosen. A distant echo of surgical tools clinking. Welcome to blood lore, where forgotten history bleeds and truth is never sterile. Tonight we peel back the gauze of time to expose what medicine tried to hide. A surgeon who claimed to heal pain, but left behind something far worse. This is the story of Dr. Thaddeus Greaves, 1851. 11 children, a surgeon with no past, and the bodies that still whisper. But before we begin, subscribe to Blood Lore for more buried files, cursed legacies, and truths that never made it to the textbooks. Now, take a breath. You may want to hold it, because what you're about to hear was never meant to be found. The town of Edivane was never meant to thrive. Tucked between the black hills of North Staffordshire and the stagnant rivers that soaked its valley floor, it was a place built on coal, soot, and sorrow. In 1851, the air was thick with more than just ash. Something far heavier lingered in the lungs and minds of the townsfolk. Death had become common, not in the usual sense, but with a rhythm. People were dying on the same days of the week. Children first, then women, then with eerie regularity, the men who came to dig their graves. And no one knew why. The town physician, Dr. Harrow, kept issuing the same explanation to every grieving family. Lung sickness, likely from the mines. But Edivane had lived with coal dust for decades. This was different. Victims complained not of coughing, but of voices of shadows in their rooms before sleep, of dreams where they saw themselves dying, and then woke up with blood on their pillows. Churches remained open day and night, candles burning through the misty evenings. The mines shut down and the pubs emptied. People stayed inside. A silent curfew formed not by law but by fear. Then in early March he arrived. Dr. Thaddeus Greaves came to Edivane on foot, dragging behind him a small black trunk and leading a pale horse that carried the rest of his tools. He claimed to be a medical man from the South, trained in old techniques that he believed might help a place gripped by unnatural mourning. His voice was calm, measured, and his eyes, glassy gray, did not blink often. But he offered his services freely and treated the poor before he ever set foot near the vicar's door. His presence was immediately polarizing. Some felt relief simply watching him work. He didn't dress like the other doctors. He wore long black coats with covered buttons and never removed his gloves, not even when he examined patients. He refused to practice inside the town infirmary and instead set up a temporary surgery in the chapel ruins just outside Edivane's western border. He said the light was better there. Within a week, 7 children, all of whom had been bedbound with fevers and muttering in their sleep, were up and walking. Their color returned. Their breathing was clear. Parents wept with joy and kissed his coat hems. A boy named Elias, who had been nearly catatonic for days, was heard speaking again, though his voice had changed. It was flatter, slower. Still, the people called Greaves a blessing, a miracle worker. God's surgeon, someone whispered after a Sunday Mass. Even Reverend Hall, once skeptical, bowed his head to the man as he passed. Edivane, it seemed, had been saved. But not everyone shared the joy. Mrs. Calder, a widow whose son had been one of the first healed, spoke in hushed tones to a midwife weeks later. She said her boy no longer dreamt. He didn't sleepwalk like he used to, didn't cry, didn't laugh. He's not cruel, she said, staring at the hearth, but I don't think he remembers. He's my child. Another woman claimed her daughter now spoke languages she had never been taught. One man swore his brother, who had suffered from a lung affliction, for years now wandered to the chapel at night and stood there motionless for hours. Still, the cures kept coming. Greaves never asked for coin, but always insisted the patient be brought alone. No family, no clergy, no witnesses. Just him, his satchel, and the black table beneath the chapel's arch. When pressed on his methods, Greaves always gave the same soft reply. I only remove what causes pain. What's left behind is peace. Rumors grew, but so did dependence. The townspeople had begun to feel that without Greaves they would all surely perish. They said he brought light to their dark season, that he had changed the fate of Edavane. In truth, he had. Because after Greaves came, the deaths stopped. But so did the music. So did the laughter. So did the dreams. The town was breathing again, but not alive, and no one seemed to notice. The change was subtle at first, easy to dismiss. After all, the people of Edavane were simply grateful to be alive, to see their children upright and walking, to bury their shovels instead of their dead. But as the weeks passed, those who had once wept with joy began to glance sideways at the ones they had nearly lost. Take Martha Enderby, for instance. Her son Jonah had been on death's edge when she brought him to Dr. Greaves. His eyes had rolled back in his skull, and he had spoken gibberish for days. But after just one afternoon in Greaves' care, the boy had returned home. Quiet, clean, and calm. Too calm. He no longer asked for supper. He never cried. He didn't even flinch when a kettle spilled near his leg. Martha tested him one day by pinching his arm. Hard. He didn't blink, only turned to her and said in a voice without tone, "I've been made better." He wasn't the only one. Dozens of patients, children, elderly, even minors, had returned from Greaves' care with similar flatness. They were not ill anymore, but neither were they well. They were emptied. Their smiles didn't reach their eyes. They stopped remembering names of things or dates or family members. Some stood for hours at windows. Others muttered strange phrases in unfamiliar tongues. One boy, barely 10, recited lines from a book no one in town had ever heard of. When asked where he learned them, he only said, "They whisper when I sleep." Reverend Hall attempted to speak to Dr. Greaves about the changes. Greaves listened politely, but offered no explanation. He said healing comes at a cost, and that perhaps some people mourn the pain more than they admit. The Reverend pressed him further, asking if the children were being experimented on. Greaves only smiled and responded, "Pain has shape, Reverend. I simply reshape it." After that, Greaves would no longer allow clergy near his patients. One young girl, Eliza Morell, had been a quiet soul even before falling ill. But after her recovery, her behavior shifted into something darker. Her mother found her one evening drawing circles on the walls of their cottage, using ashes from the hearth. When asked what she was doing, Eliza replied, "Making the windows he asked for." She then pointed to a shadow in the corner of the room and said, "That's where he waits when I'm asleep." The next morning her drawings had vanished. So had her memory of making them. But perhaps the most unsettling change was communal. The town itself began to fall into a hush. There were fewer greetings in the streets, fewer church bells. Even the animals seemed to sense something. They avoided the chapel where Greaves still worked, pacing its borders but never stepping past the rotted fence line. Dogs howled at night for no apparent reason, and birds that used to gather near the bell tower vanished altogether. By April, Edavane was full of people who moved like marionettes. Healthy bodies, quiet voices, dull eyes. The children played less, and when they did, they played in tight circles, whispering among themselves in chants no one taught them. One local midwife claimed she heard 3 of them singing beneath their breath outside the old infirmary. She leaned in close to hear the words and ran home white-faced. She never repeated what she heard, only said it sounded like grief spoken backwards. Even those who had not gone to Greaves started behaving oddly, if only because they were slowly surrounded by those who had. The town no longer felt like a town. It felt like a waiting room. One man, Elias Harrow, son of the town's original physician, had grown suspicious early on. He began keeping notes on the people treated by Greaves, charting their speech, their habits, even their dreams. But the patterns disturbed him so deeply that he eventually stopped writing. On the last page of his journal, he scribbled, "Whatever he takes from them, it leaves room for something else." And then Elias left. No one saw where he went. No one looked for him. By midsummer, there were over 70 individuals in Edivane who had been healed. Each of them bore the same stillness, the same distant stares, and an almost imperceptible delay when spoken to, like someone else was listening first. No one accused Greaves. Why would they? He had saved them all. But every now and then a child would wake screaming in the night, not from a nightmare, but from silence. One boy told his mother, trembling, "It was too quiet in my head. I couldn't hear me anymore." She didn't understand what he meant. She never would, because she too had been healed. Her name was Nurse Evelyn Lyle, though the townspeople of Edivane would come to forget it, if not deliberately, then out of survival. She arrived in the spring of 1851, shortly after Dr. Greaves had embedded himself in the rotting bones of the town's chapel ruins. At the time, Evelyn was young, eager, and desperate for work, having lost her previous post at a Liverpool asylum under mysterious conditions. The record said emotional instability. She claimed the opposite, that she had seen something no one dared document. So when Greaves offered her a role as his assistant, she accepted. It was an odd arrangement from the beginning. He told her there would be no formal patients, no written schedules, no second opinions. "You are to observe, not intervene," he had said in that slow, airless voice. And she did, for weeks. But what she saw, she could not forget. Evelyn began keeping a secret journal within the folds of her uniform. In the margins of a faded prayer book, she scribbled what she witnessed behind the bricked walls of the chapel. Her notes weren't just about surgery, they were about ritual. She never saw Greaves use a scalpel in the conventional sense. His tools were curved in unnatural shapes, blackened as if forged in fire but cold to the touch. Some resembled instruments of healing, others resembled keys. He never sterilized them. Beneath every bed, if one could call the low wooden planks a bed, he drew symbols, not with chalk, but with a mixture Evelyn could only identify by smell. Iron, herbs, and something faintly sweet, like spoiled fruit. The patients were placed in strange positions, arms crossed, palms up, mouths closed with thin cords of twine. They never resisted. They never screamed. In fact, none of them ever spoke once inside the room. That was one of the first things she wrote. They go silent before they're touched, like they're waiting for permission. She noted that Greaves often murmured to himself in a language she didn't recognize. Soft, guttural phrases repeated as his fingers hovered over the patient's skulls, ribs, or sternums. No incisions, no bandages. And yet when he stepped back, the sick would rise, seemingly whole. But Evelyn knew something had been taken. She saw it in their eyes, how they didn't blink quite right, how they didn't return. It was healing without recovery, survival without presence. One night, Evelyn stayed behind after Greaves retired to his quarters. She crept into the chapel's lower vault, where he kept his tools and patient records. But there were no files, no ledgers, only rows of sealed jars floating with pieces she could not name. Eyes too large for a child's skull, hands with no nails, vertebrae carved with symbols. And at the center of the room, something worse, a flat, circular slab stained black. The floor around it was carved with tiny words repeating over and over. She copied one phrase down. She would later learn it wasn't Latin, Greek, or Hebrew. It didn't belong to any language known by name. She dreamt about it that night, and in the dream, the words echoed in a child's voice. He does not remove pain, he moves it. From that point on, Evelyn began planning her escape. She hid pages of her journal beneath loose stones by the riverbank. She warned no one. She trusted no one. But Greaves knew. One evening, he asked her calmly if she believed she was helping. She responded that she was learning. He nodded. "Good," he said. "You'll need to remember what you've seen. Not all vessels are carved from pain." She quit the next morning, or so she thought. When she returned to the boarding house where she stayed, her belongings were gone. The landlady claimed she'd never seen her before. When Evelyn approached the local constable, he looked her up and down and asked, "You were the nurse with Dr. Greaves?" She nodded. He said nothing else. He simply closed the door. By week's end, Evelyn fled Edavane by foot. But one archaeologist, a folklore archivist named Dr. Cleland, recognized something chilling. The symbols in Evelyn's journal matched carvings recently unearthed beneath a 3,000-year-old burial site in southern Iraq. And yet Greaves had drawn them, perfectly, precisely, long before archaeology ever reached those ruins. By the end of autumn, whispers had begun to seep beyond the borders of Edavane. Neighboring towns were sending letters of concern to the local constables and clergy. The same rumors repeated in each one of unnatural recoveries, of children walking with fixed stares, of a man claiming to heal pain who was never seen at prayer. The town council remained silent, but a decision was made behind closed doors. Dr. Thaddeus Greaves would be transferred. They called it a professional reassignment, but no one explained who issued the order. There was no seal from the Royal College of Physicians, no official hearing or report. Greaves was simply approached one morning by two men in dark coats, neither of whom gave a name. They spoke with him briefly outside the chapel. Greaves showed no emotion. He simply nodded, packed his satchel, and left with them, calmly, as though he had known this would happen all along. But he didn't leave alone. 11 children were chosen to go with him, all former patients. Their parents signed something that was never shown to the public, a consent transfer, it was said, for continued care. These children were not sick anymore, at least not in the traditional sense. But each of them exhibited the same traits: muted affect, forgetfulness, and in some cases complete dissociation from their families. They followed Greaves without resistance. Not one cried. Not one asked why. They were taken to Black Grove Asylum, a facility that sat nearly 40 miles northeast, past the fog-drenched moors of Ashendown. It was a place most knew only by name, an old psychiatric institute used for non-conforming patients. Those who entered were rarely released. The people of Edavane never saw the children again. At first, the townsfolk consoled themselves with vague hope. Some even said the move was a blessing, that the children would get real care, that Greaves was being watched, that they could begin to feel safe again. But unease clung to them. No letters came from the asylum, no updates, not even a receipt of transfer. When one mother, Judith Halberd, tried to travel to Black Grove to see her son, she was stopped at the gate by a guard who told her plainly, "No Halberd child is registered here. You're mistaken." She wasn't. She showed them his baptismal certificate, his portrait, a letter from the vicar verifying his care under Dr. Greaves. They turned her away. When she returned to Edavane, the vicar denied ever writing the letter. And then came the erasure. Within weeks of Greaves' departure, files began vanishing. At first, only minor notes, supply records, treatment forms, guest logs, then medical registers themselves. The Royal Archive in London received an inquiry from a researcher trying to trace Greaves' original license, only to find no record that he had ever been certified. His name no longer appeared on hospital rosters nor asylum transfer documents. Even Nurse Lyle's journal entries, buried near the river, discovered decades later, referred to patient lists that no longer matched census data. The children he treated, the ones taken to Blackgrove, appeared in no baptismal rolls, no graveyards, not even school logs. It was as if they had never existed. Some townsfolk believed this was intentional, that the children were part of something larger, some unspoken project. Others believed the children had died, and the government had covered it up to avoid scandal. But there were darker theories, too. Rumors that the children weren't taken to be healed, but harvested. That Greaves had not been removed, but relocated to continue his work in deeper secrecy. The last known trace of the Blackgrove children came in the form of a torn medical ledger found in the attic of a long-abandoned estate in 1897. It contained a single page labeled simply Phase 3 Integration. Underneath were the names of 11 children, matching those known from Edivane. But beside each name was a date, and another name. Different. Unfamiliar. The implication, terrifyingly, was that each child had been re-identified, reborn into new files, hidden in plain sight. One final detail stood out on that page. At the bottom, written in ink darker than the rest, was a sentence. Vessels accepted. Preparations complete. Surgeon retained under auxiliary title. For some, this meant Greaves had been renamed, relocated under another identity, and allowed to continue his work in another form, perhaps under state authority. For others, it suggested something worse, that Greaves was never working alone, that an entire system had allowed it. Either way, after the asylum transfers, the trail of Greaves went cold. No further photos, no mentions in medical texts, not even obituaries. It was as if he had been erased from history with surgical precision. But every few years in old asylums, slated for demolition, in crumbling hospitals forgotten by progress, someone finds something, a sealed room, a black instrument case, a journal page scrawled in a language no one alive speaks. And in the silence of those places, the words echo like breathless whispers. Pain leaves, but something else enters. There were always murmurs in Edivane, even decades after Greaves vanished. Children grown old still refused to speak his name aloud. The chapel where he had worked collapsed in on itself one winter, struck by lightning during a thunderless storm. Locals took it as a sign. No one rebuilt. No one even cleared the rubble. But there were those who dug, researchers, paranormal historians, the curious, and the cursed. And one of them, Dr. Lennox Blythe, a folklorist from Northumberland, found something that should never have been found. It was in 1909 that Blythe arrived, determined to trace the truth behind the Greaves legend. He was skeptical of the supernatural, but fascinated by patterns, and there were patterns in Greaves' story. Disappearances, silence, altered memories, and one constant. The bodies changed. But no autopsies had ever been performed on Greaves' so-called patients, until Blythe found one. An unmarked grave just outside the original Edivane cemetery, isolated, surrounded by thorns, and buried under a flat slate stone. No name, no epitaph. Just one symbol, a perfect circle, with 3 horizontal slashes across its center. When the grave was exhumed, The body inside was almost perfectly preserved, as if death had never fully claimed it. A child no older than 9. Cause of death? Unclear. But beneath the skin, carved directly into the muscle, invisible until flayed, were symbols. Not tattoos. Not wounds from violence. These were precise, even elegant. Swirls, intersecting loops, characters like ancient alphabets, some echoing Sumerian, cuneiform, others entirely untraceable. They formed a pattern that extended from the soles of the child's feet to the crown of their head, as though the body had been mapped or rewritten. Blythe was horrified, but also intrigued. He documented every inch, every line, sketching the pattern with obsessive care. When he showed it to linguistic scholars in London, one man fainted. Another called the symbols pre-verbal sigils, a language older than language. One expert, Dr. Selwyn Heath, noted that the pattern followed what he called a sorrow path, a design theorized in ancient ritual healing that transferred suffering from one vessel to another. Heath's theory was chilling. The child hadn't been healed. The child had been converted, made into a container. It wasn't an isolated case. Further investigations, quiet and often illegal, revealed 3 more bodies in unmarked sites across England, all former patients, all from towns linked to Greaves, all bearing the same internal marks, all unchanged by time. But the markings weren't random. They aligned with ancient schematics found in obscure grimoire fragments and black alchemical texts. The body wasn't being decorated, it was being formatted, prepared, like parchment before writing. Worse still, when exposed to certain frequencies, low subharmonic sounds recorded in old cathedrals, the sigils reacted. The preserved flesh pulsed faintly as if remembering pain or expecting it. Then came the incident with the surviving twin. A woman named Lydia Quinby, aged 72, living in a seaside asylum in Devon, claimed in her youth she and her twin brother had both been taken to Greaves. She had survived. He had not. Her caretakers dismissed her stories as delusion. But when Dr. Blythe interviewed her, she recited the same symbols he had drawn years earlier, by memory. She claimed Greaves had drawn them onto her brother's skin using fingers that hummed. She remembered him chanting. She remembered light without a source. And she remembered her brother smiling just before he went silent, forever. She said, "He healed my brother's pain, not his body. Just the pain. I think it went somewhere else. I think it went into me." When asked what she meant, she lifted her gown. Her back was covered in scars, not from injury, but from writing. Lines and shapes that matched Greaves' symbols, carved from the inside out. She died that night. The attending nurse said her body twisted in the final moments, not from seizure, but from pressure, like something beneath her skin was pushing upward, trying to escape. Autopsy was denied. The body was cremated within 12 hours. But rumors spread that her ashes didn't cool, that her name vanished from asylum records within a day, that the fireplace where she was cremated collapsed inward, never to be rebuilt. By the 1930s, the Greaves pattern had become forbidden knowledge among certain circles of scholars and occult historians. It was believed that the surgeon of sorrow wasn't practicing medicine at all, but was preparing human beings to serve as receptors for pain, for spirits, for knowledge. No one could say. But the patterns continued to appear. In post-war Europe, in abandoned hospitals, in derelict orphanages, bodies were found with no recorded illness, no known injuries, but the same flawless markings beneath the flesh, hidden inscriptions, glyphs written inside the human canvas. And somewhere, always near those sites, a symbol would be etched into stone, A circle. 3 horizontal slashes, the mark of the surgeon. Whatever Greaves had been doing in 1851 had not ended with his vanishing. It had only begun. For decades, the name Thaddeus Greaves disappeared from public memory. Medical journals omitted him. Asylum records were shredded, sealed, or mysteriously lost in fires. Even in folk tales, his legacy faded like smoke, until the age of machines remembered what men had tried to forget, i.e., it began quietly. In 1997, a medical technician in Oslo flagged a CT scan that didn't make sense. The patient, a 6-year-old boy with migraines, showed no internal injury, but when the technician enhanced the soft tissue contrast, she noticed faint linear distortions around the occipital lobe, marks that didn't belong to any known diagnosis. They weren't errors, they weren't vascular, they looked intentional. Like writing. Weeks later, in Argentina, a radiologist reviewing a spinal MRI of a trauma survivor reported non-organic filament shapes embedded between vertebrae. They formed circular patterns, precise and symmetrical. The patient had never had surgery. By the early 2000s, reports were appearing globally, scattered, dismissed, hidden deep in archives, and flagged as imaging artifacts. But a small community of underground researchers began collecting these anomalies. They called them somatic glyphs, impossible markings found beneath skin, in muscle and tissue, almost always in patients who had survived immense suffering, war, abuse, disaster, or loss. The more they collected, the more the pattern emerged. The glyphs weren't random. They mirrored the same markings found on bodies from Edavane, and every set of glyphs followed one consistent rule. No two were the same. Yet all obeyed the geometry outlined in Greaves' original journals. That's when a linguist named Dr. Iona Merrick, a skeptic turned believer, cross-referenced the glyphs against the 1909 sketches by folklorist Lennox Blythe. Her results send ripples through forbidden corners of academia. The glyphs formed syntax, a language. But it wasn't one meant to be read. It was one meant to be felt. Each set of symbols, when traced, corresponded to neurological reactions: panic, calm, euphoria, nausea, sorrow, and most disturbingly, absence. Some glyphs, when shown to patients who bore them unknowingly, caused the person to disassociate, as if something inside them remembered something they consciously did not. Merrick's team published nothing. Most of her colleagues refused to continue the work. Some fell ill. One suffered a breakdown, insisting his own child had been rewritten after a fever, and began drawing the same symbols in crayon without ever having seen them. The child never spoke again. By 2013, whispers of a resurgence in pain displacement medicine began circulating in darknet forums disguised as fringe therapy methods. Practitioners claimed to relieve trauma using forbidden sigils, most of which matched Greaves' documented symbols. Those who received the therapy often reported immediate relief from lifelong suffering. But something else came with the relief. Dreams, voices, hallucinations of a man in a coat stained dark, whose fingers clicked like metal on glass, a surgeon with no eyes, a whisper that came during sleep. You no longer carry your sorrow, but it was never destroyed. Meanwhile, urban explorers investigating shuttered hospitals in Poland, the UK, and northern France began finding sealed rooms behind crumbled walls. Inside, crude metal beds, rusted tools, and symbols burned into the concrete floor, still faintly warm. One such room in Essex contained only a single object, a surgical mask from the 19th century. Inside its linen folds was stitched a name: T. Greaves. But Greaves should have been long dead. No obituary, No record of burial, no descendants. And yet, a leaked photo from a private hospital security camera in Boston, taken in 2019, showed a figure entering an empty operating room at 3:17 a.m. No face was visible. The figure walked without sound. No one had scheduled surgery. No logs recorded access. But the next morning, the patient in the adjacent ICU, a comatose woman, was awake. Her cancer, untreatable the day before, had vanished. Doctors celebrated a miracle. But the patient only stared at the mirror for hours, repeating, "He fixed it. But I don't feel like me." Then in 2022, an anonymous researcher uploaded a document titled The Surgeon of Sorrow Integration Files. The file traced modern cases of unexplainable recoveries, symbols beneath skin, and missing medical records. It concluded with a map, a global web of sites spanning centuries, all linked by one thing: a perfect circle with 3 horizontal slashes, the mark of Greaves. The file disappeared within 48 hours, every download corrupted, every mirror vanished. But copies circulate in whispers, hidden folders, encrypted archives on digital dead drops. Those who read it say, only one phrase sticks with you after you close it. Pain can be moved, but never destroyed. It must go somewhere. And somewhere out there, in the forgotten corridors of old hospitals, or in the glowing screens of modern clinics, the work continues, quietly, elegantly, horrifically. Greaves was never healing the body. He was editing it, making space, preparing vessels. And pain, after all, is eternal.